the United States and China can reach areas of common interest, which would become areas of common action, and that sometimes, in fact, we are simply stopped from doing things that are in both sides' interests, that are win-win in the overused phrase, because there's this distrust and lack of knowledge and lack of history of people who know each other talking to each other. And if we can overcome that, we can at least put forward some of these ideas.
Hello, my name is Reva Goujon, Director at Rhodium Group, and on behalf of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, I'm pleased to talk with Admiral Dennis Blair, not distinguished visiting professor at UNC Chapel Hill, about the U.S. China Track 2 dialogue on the digital economy and recent consensus agreement. Admiral Blair, pleasure to have you here, and looking forward to the conversation.
Good to be talking with you, Reva.
Admiral Blair, you've been involved in a U.S.-China Track 2 dialogue focused on the digital economy, and this is a topic that encompasses everything from semiconductor development to cross-border data flows to AI. And given your very deep national security background as former commander of U.S. PACOM, former director of national intelligence, you're an especially compelling person to conduct a bilateral discussion with China on such thorny issues when U.S.-China tech competition is clearly intensifying. So to start off, I would love for you to walk us through what exactly is a Track 2 dialogue and what is the general goal of this initiative?
Right, Reva, a Track 2 dialogue is a relatively structured conversation between former government officials, like I am, and also generally includes either subject matter experts or business people who are involved in the same area, also academics. And the idea is that government officials are heavily constrained when they talk with other leaders, Americans and Chinese government officials, that those who do not have government responsibilities now can perhaps be a bit more honest, fulsome, imaginative, and out of those discussions, but hopefully they'll be realistic because some of us served in government before, and we know you just can't blue sky these things. You have to come up with observation ideas that are practical. But the idea would be, out of these more free discussions of former officials and other experts and involved people will come ideas which can then make their way into the government channels and perhaps nudge official government negotiations either faster or more widely in what they consider. And I've seen over the years this be successful in terms of ideas that were originally generated outside of government in Track 2 dialogues being adopted by governments and actually leading to action. So that's the concept.
And I imagine it's quite challenging in trying to just create that more open, freer, imaginative climate for a freer flow of discussion on these difficult issues. And when it comes to the consensus agreement that comes out of this and was one of the deliverables of the Track 2, how does that negotiation play out in practice of what actually goes into a document like that?
I think it's important to note that one advantage that Track 2 dialogues have, if they're done right, is that there's a consistency of participation on both sides that can go over multiple meetings, multiple years. For example, our dialogue began in 2019, so it's been going for 5 years. And I'd say the majority of the participants on both the Chinese and on the U.S. side have been the same. So we at least get by the suspicion of ignorance. When you don't know somebody, you're not going to be very forthcoming. And because we spend time together outside of the formal sessions, meals and travel and so on, we can develop at least a degree of personal trust, which I think makes it easier for us to make recommendations. So part of the good thing about a Track 2 dialogue is not only what's written down in the commentary, and I'll come to in the agreements, the consensus agreements, and I'll come to that, but the things that are said around the meetings, which can be, again, conveyed to those who now have government positions informally, and can go beyond what's in the formal document, because what's in the formal document is a matter of public record, and I would say it's more of a risk of being daring and different and innovative in that on the Chinese side than there is on the U.S. side. I mean, about the worst that we can get on the U.S. side is a nasty email from a former friend in government who says, you shouldn't have said that. That's not part of our position. On the Chinese side, the penalties are much heavier in terms of access, travel permission. So the informal feedback that is passed around is important. But as for the consensus agreement, the topics are generally pretty easy to come up with. And when it comes up to the language, we try to reflect the area of real consensus, but where there is no real consensus, then we sort of follow the 1972 U.S. China rule, which is that each side gets to write what its views are. So you'll see in some of our past consensus agreements, the United States believes that China does so and so. The Chinese side believes that the U.S. side does so and so. So that way we avoid the whole business of trying to negotiate what are real differences, but simply note them and put them down. So we note those differences, we set the overall context, and then we do come up with recommendations, and there does have to be consensus on the recommendations, and that's often very difficult. But I think what we all believe who are involved in track twos, or else we wouldn't be doing it, is that the United States and China can reach areas of common interest, which would become areas of common action, and that sometimes, in fact, we are simply stopped from doing things that are in both sides' interests, that are win-win in the overused phrase, because there's this distrust and lack of knowledge and lack of history of people who know each other talking to each other. And if we can overcome that, we can at least put forward some of these ideas.
Yeah, I can imagine 5 years of fostering those relationships can pay off in a big way. In getting more to the substance of the recommendations in the consensus agreement, if you were to stack those in terms of most likely or least likely to gain traction in both or either Beijing and Washington, what would you want to highlight as some of the ones that are more in that pragmatic realm on both sides that could have some momentum?
Right. I mean, in the area that we work in, the area of digital economy, I'd say there are three big areas of recommendation which we keep coming back to again and again. One we call on the governments of both sides to have a consistency in their policy, or predictability in it, set principles, derive regulations from those principles, and make it something that is pretty clear, not sort of a last minute gotcha that pops out of nowhere. The second one is that the regulations that are imposed on international business by both sides need to be clear and transparent. I mean, businessmen and this area of the digital economy is overwhelmingly a business generated area. Businessmen can adjust as long as they know what the rules are. So we consistently evolve making the rules, sticking to them, advertising them, and not following the pornography standard. I'll know it when I see it. And so, try something and then we'll tell you can't do it after you try it. But let's try to get more transparency and clarity. And then the final one is the area of white lanes or go zones as opposed to no-go zones. Let's pick out some areas that seem far away from national security, far away from jeopardizing individual privacy, which would benefit both countries, agricultural research, health benefits. Now, unfortunately, these areas are becoming increasingly politicized as mistrust deepens and as overall atmosphere between the two countries becomes difficult. But when you take a step back from it, which we have the luxury of doing as track two dialogues, you can say, wait a minute, it just doesn't make sense that both Chinese and American researchers cannot figure out better strains of plants and that will deal with climate, a warmer climate. They can't deal with things to save sufferers from this disease in both countries. And so we try to push for those areas that stay well clear of national security, but would benefit both countries, not only for their own sake, but to try to begin to develop some stones that we can step on of cooperation in this onrushing sea of mistrust and autarky, which seems to be the trend these days.
Well, as you point out, there are some areas that are becoming increasingly politicized. And I noticed how some of the conclusions appear to run in opposition to really the trajectory of both US and Chinese policy in some areas, right? Like, so AI cooperation in healthcare was listed as one of the areas that should be preserved for engagement. But the US is also in the process of ramping up data security measures in this arena. It's setting biotech-specific thresholds for the oversight of foundational AI models, also encouraging trade in chips used in consumer electronics, green energy, and healthcare. That is also laid against this argument that China's growing production in trailing edge chips is fueling a lot of anxiety in the US, right? Over building dependencies on China, the potential for those dependencies to be exercised as coercive leverage in a crisis scenario. So how do you reconcile those kinds of concerns with the types of conclusions that are being made in this document?
Well, we do it two ways, I would say, Reva. One way is by really looking hard at whether a claim of leverage, advantage, or dependency disadvantage actually holds up when you stop and think about it with real experts in the field looking at it. And it turns out some of them do, but a lot of them don't. In many of them, it's physically impossible to hurt the other guy without hurting yourself. And I think we're sort of learning this over time. You know, China cuts off rare metals to Japan in 2012, and Japan builds up its own separate supply chains. And you see this happening all the time. And so we, as a general principle, we call for this idea of reasonable neutral dependence. So some dependence, because that's efficient, but not so much that it offers the temptation, much less reality of an economic lever. And there really, as you look back over economic history, there haven't been any levers that have really been effective over a long term against countries that have economies as big, as diverse, and as adaptable as the U.S. and the Chinese economies, the top two in the world. So we try to bring a set of reason into those arguments by examining the specifics. So that's one of our ideas that we consistently do. And then the other part of it is to try to get the idea of bargains, I would say, or individual ideas that if the United States will take this action, say not restrict a certain level of performance semiconductor, then China will not take that action. For example, restricting American or other international companies who want to operate in China by burdensome regulation, by joint venture requirements, by threats to actual executives and workers, and so this idea of small reciprocal steps, which would encourage mutually beneficial trade. So those are the two ideas that we suggest. We sometimes see glimmers of them. I would be kidding you if I said that both sides say, well, that's a great idea, let's go let's go off and do it. But I think we do create a bit of an intellectual climate that gives alternatives to just this. Anything that China does in the semiconductor space is bad. Anything that the U.S. does is good, and vice versa on the Chinese side.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm wondering, Admiral Blair, if you can paint for us really two pictures here. What would be the outlook in US China relations if the majority of these recommendations were actually taken up by both policymakers in Beijing and Washington versus the outlook if they fall on deaf ears? What would be at stake? And especially as we have a US election ahead of us.
I mean, we can have a situation in which there is a China-centered infosphere and a U.S., Europe, Japan-centered infosphere. And both of those are huge markets. They're huge research establishments. They're very large companies. So it would be possible for these supply chains to eventually to be separated, largely separated, and live there. So it's not impossible that if the current direction of mistrust increasingly pulling back parts of the supply chain into one country or the other country or continue, that's not the end of the world. There will be things, but the penalties we're paying are tremendous duplication of effort to achieve the same result. So wasting resources on both sides. We're denying best of class links in the supply chain to both sides. I mean, as you know, the semiconductor supply chain has become highly individualized in the 30 or so steps to make a chip. Some are done in the United States. Information or actual products are shifted over to another country, shifted back. I mean, the number of trans-Pacific crossings is huge, and that's been developed because it makes these things cheaper and faster and better. So we would sacrifice something which is not only too bad for the countries concerned because they waste important IT resources on it, but it further removes that idea that maybe we shouldn't be talking about fighting when we do have things that we can do together, which hopefully will eventually replace the current alarmist atmosphere of, Thucydides' trap, 2027, bound to fight, all of that stuff. And many of us who've been in the U.S. China business for a long time think that is incorrect. There's United States and China that have a world big enough for both of them if both sides could see. Each side, of course, is more convinced of its own righteousness than and the others. You've talked to enough Chinese to know that this idea of it's your fault, not our fault, goes across both sides, and we'd need to overcome that. But if our recommendations were accepted, I think they'd be both an initiator of better things that would benefit both sides, and also they would be a sign that perhaps the underlying distrust has attenuated somewhat.
Mm. And Admiral Blair, is there anything that you would like to highlight from this track 2 or the process itself or otherwise before we conclude?
I would just say that on a personal level, it's a little harder to dislike and distrust people that you actually talk with, and so I find it personally valuable to talk with Chinese about what it's like from their point of view than it is to simply read intelligence reports or either government or private reports that pick out the most challenging plans of Chinese intelligence agencies or military forces, and just to realize that there are other Chinese who are not waking up every morning trying to figure out a way to mess up the United States businesses, United States military forces, or intelligence services, and that there are people out there in China who want to do the things that lots of Americans want to do. And I think if the majority could impose their will on their own governments and their own countries, we could find ways to get through this. And it's personally satisfying to play a role, however small, in trying to reach that stage. And I think we need that counterweight to the sort of ratcheting up, self-reinforcing distrust and an idea that one country can outmuscle the other outmuscle the other country, much less do it through conflict.
Yes, this is certainly a quiet and underappreciated area of U.S. China relations. And personally, I feel very assured in knowing that people like yourself, of your stature, with your deep national security credentials, are the ones in the lead for dialogues like this with Chinese counterparts. So thank you for doing this, and thank you for sharing your insights today.
No, good to talk with you, Reva. Good and good luck to you and your team, because the analytical efforts of things like rhodium and all is also important to inform people what the real situation is, as opposed to, what playing to everybody's worst fears. So
Yeah,
thanks a
we
lot for what
do
you do.
try to, well, appreciate that. We try to sober up these conversations as well, and bringing data to the table. But thank you again, Admiral Blair, and thank you as well to the National Committee staff behind the scenes who helped to make this interview possible. If you enjoyed it, we hope you will return for future National Committee programs. Thank you so much.